Right, so now we're going to go ahead and dynamically add new form elements in a Django Formset via JavaScript. Now we've already seen this before, and it's inside of the admin in the inlines, right? So in the inline, I can actually add as many form elements as I want. Now it's not really adding a new HTML form. It's really just adding inputs and some data about those inputs. So that's actually what we want to do now. Now, before I go much further, what I will say is one of the ways you could add more of those form elements is by updating this extra call. Very similar, if not exactly what the admin does. So if I say extra equals to 2, and I look at any given recipe updater, I can actually see those two empty elements here. And those are fine, but it's actually not the route we want to go. We want to dynamically add those. So I'll leave those in as 0. And there is one other glitch that I need to fix, and that is adding in this child recipe here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right there to make sure that all of the form elements are being saved. So all of the, the actual recipe ingredient query set is being saved. Cool. And so now what I want to do is jump back into the template itself. And there's something that I can add in here that's going to make things really nice. So outside of this form in form set, right underneath it, I'm going to go ahead and do div, and we're going to put in here the formset.empty form. We're going to save that, and we're going to refresh in here. Now it's an empty form. So if I do pasta noodle and 1 pound and hit save, well, what happens? Nothing. It actually does not save any of that data. It will not go into the database. That's because that form is actually meant as a way for me to copy that form element. In other words, I can come in here and give it an ID. Let's go ahead and call this empty form and also give it a class of hidden. That hidden class, I'm going to go ahead and add up here, and we'll just give it a display none. Okay. And so now if I rerun this, that form is no longer displayed to the user, but naturally it's going to be inside of here in my element right there. Okay. So initially I'll just leave that class of none being gone, right? So we can still see it and we can interact with it as much as we want. Okay. So the next thing is to actually create a button that's going to toggle additional of these classes. So let's go ahead and do that. So button ID equals to add more. Give it a type of just simply button, and then we'll say add more. Okay. So whenever you put buttons inside of a form, sometimes you run into issues by default. In other words, let's refresh this page. If I hit add more, it's certainly possible that it accidentally submits the form. So if I do ABC and hit add more, that could happen. Now, in this case, it's not happening because, well, I didn't give the type of submit. I just gave the type of button. So it's important that you do add in the type of button. Okay, so now we actually have the basis to add additional forms, the actual empty forms, but it's going to take several steps to get there, and it's all through JavaScript. So you're going to have to bear with me on this if you've never used JavaScript before, but it's not that much different than Python. There are some certain syntax things that make it a little different, but overall it's very similar to Python in this case. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to think about how I'm going to be adding this form. Well, the form is going to be responding to me clicking on add more, right? So if I click on add more, it should add more forms. Simple enough. So what that means is then I need to listen or attach some sort of event to when this button is clicked. When I say event, I mean literally the action of a button being pressed, or this particular button being pressed, or this HTML element being pressed. I want to then copy this HTML element all through code, right? And so let's go ahead and do that. Now in Python, you probably know that something like add more btn would be declared like this. So this would be the variable of add more btn. Inside of JavaScript, we use either const, let, or var in front of that variable. So const means it's a constant and it will never change. And so in this case, it definitely will be a constant. This is actually important in JavaScript. It's not important in Python. Python doesn't have constants that work like this in front of variables. In any case, we can now want to grab this element. Now, there's not very many identifying factors to this element other than this right here. certainly it's a button, but there's a bunch of other things that are buttons. And certainly it's a type of button, but there's other things that have a button. And so what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and grab this by its ID. We want to look for this element by ID. Now to do this, there's a command called document.getElement by ID. And then you literally copy and paste what that ID is. And so this is how we actually can grab this element inside of JavaScript. That's it, right? And so from that, I can actually add in what's called an event listener. And there's all kinds of event listeners. The one we're using is just simply click. And then in here, we want to call some sort of function. Okay. So a function in JavaScript. So in Python, we define our functions as define, something like add new form, and it's going to take in some arguments, and then, it would return some value or do something like that. Okay. And so JavaScript is not a whole lot different than this, but instead of def, you would just do function. And then instead of a colon here, you would use curly brackets. And we don't need a return statement in this case, but you can also return values in a JavaScript function. So that's it. That's really just a plain old JavaScript function. And so since it is a named function, I can actually pass it in here. Now there are functions that are not named that you can actually do something like this. This is called an arrow function or fat arrow function, an anonymous function. That is a little bit more advanced and something you'll see from time to time. But for now, I'll just use in the name function. And there we go. So we have this add more button with an event listener and a function called add new form. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and type in my arguments. So I'm just going to say args here. Now in Python, we would go print whatever those args are to find out what arguments come in to this function by default based off of this click event listener. And so I'm actually, in JavaScript, you can't use print, of course. You have to use console log, right? So console log is the same thing as print in Python, okay? And comments are // right? Instead of hashtag. All of these little things that end up making it kind of frustrating to change between languages. But once we do all this stuff, you'll see why it's really, really good. Okay, so now that we've got that, let's go ahead and refresh in here. I'm now going to click on this add more button several times. Remember how I said console log? Well, one of the things that you'll see over here is the console. This is the JavaScript console. Of course, if you don't see that, you can go to View and Developer and JavaScript console, click on that. In this case, it actually toggled it down for me, but if I actually look at it again, it'll bring it back up and there's my console. And so I've got all of these things coming in here. These are all of those events. So if I refresh again, hit add more, it's showing a bunch of events. Now, if I hit save, it shouldn't actually show those events, right? I hit save, it doesn't show anything. In fact, it actually reloaded the page for me. I try to do add more, I hit save, it literally reloads the page because I'm saving all the data as it says, data saved. But what happens with this event listener is I can just add a new form, or at least I'm calling this event. So this argument is actually called an event. Add event listener, not that surprising maybe that when a click happens, it actually gives that event to this form itself. And so all I'm going to do here is add a condition called if event, then we'll do event.prevent default. Okay, that's it. Now, this event.prevent default means that if you accidentally called this submit, this would not allow it to be submitting. Now, there's a lot of things that we could talk about here. I'm not going to talk about those things right now. But overall now, we will no longer see a console log, and the page should not refresh like it does when I hit save. And you'll notice that by the little flicker up here. Yeah. Okay, cool. So we have the basis of two solid elements. What's the next step here? So after this is clicked, now add a new empty form to our, or rather form element, say, to our HTML form. That's what we want to do. So how do we do that? Well, we have a empty form, an example right here. So I can have a new constant in here and say empty form element. And this is going to be now document.getElement by ID again, because we have an ID here, and I can grab that element. Cool. And so in this case, what I'm actually going to do is bring this element into the function itself. Now, one of the things you hopefully are wondering is like, what's this document thing referring to? Well, that actually refers to the final rendered page that's here. So notice it says doc type HTML. It's referring to this entire page here. So anything that's, in theory, anything that's on this entire page, the JavaScript should be able to grab it by using document.getElement by ID, or getElement by something else as well. So it's very often that that isn't the case, but for what we've done here, we haven't done very many advanced things. That's certainly the case. So this actually grabs that form for me. And what I can do actually is I can clone this form or copy that entire div by doing dot clone node and passing true in here. So this will be a copy of the original one. And so what I want to do now is I want to remove the class if there is any class in there. So I'm just going to reset that element basically. And we'll go ahead and take the empty form element itself, the actual constant here, and then on there, there's a bunch of instance methods that we can run. Something like set attribute and the actual HTML attribute that we want to set. So in this case, we'll say class, and I want to set it equal to, hey, the same class that we have here, which is just simply ingredient form, like that. So now it's going to set that attribute. So in theory, it should actually remove the class that's in here, and that's it. Next, what I want to do is I actually want to add this form somewhere. Well, where do I want to add it? Well, probably at the end of the for loop of my current ingredient forms, or at least right before this button here. I'm actually going to add it to the end of my current form list. So what I'm going to do here is say class equals to maybe the ingredient form list, or just ingredients. It really doesn't matter so much of what you end up calling this. So notice that I use class. I could use class or ID. Now I'm going to stick with ID for now to make things simple, but I'm going to go ahead and grab the ID of it. And yet again, I'm going to add a new constant. So this constant I'll set above the empty form element, and we're going to call this our form copy target. And this is going to be document.getElement by ID again. And it's that right there. Now in this case, of course, we're not cloning it. I do not want to duplicate this target. Instead, what I want to do is just append the new duplicate. Okay. So far, so good. This is hopefully not that hard yet. So we refresh in here. And if I go into console, I have no errors. If I see something like, I say that gibberish in here. If I see something like this, this means that I have errors and I need to fix them. Oftentimes you can actually see what the errors are right inside of that console, right? Which in this case, it's just showing that gibberish. So let's go ahead and go back and get rid of that gibberish. And let's go ahead and try out our new form here. I refresh in here and I hit add more, add more, add more, add more. Hey, that's pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and inspect the element on any of these. And what I should notice is the class names being ingredient form. That's great. The empty form itself is not showing that class name. So I do want to get rid of what that empty class name should be. All right. So the empty one should be simply hidden. And that is going to be our initial class. And there we go. So we got our ingredient form class. Let's try this again. Let me close down the elements here. I hit add new, add new, add new. Great. Now, it doesn't look great, I would say, in relation to what the other form did, right? So the other form being what we actually had in our form set as p tags, but it is close to that. And so what if we actually decided to say .as p here, right? Can we do that? So it's an empty form, add more. Hey, what do you know? The same sort of actual feature existed here. So if you're using Django Crispy Forms, you can still use Crispy there. But we actually run into a huge problem with where we're at right now. And I'll go ahead and say pasta noodles, some quantity in here. Now, notice this, it's not actually giving us the correct value. We'll talk about that in a second. And then I'll go ahead and hit save. And let's just refresh in here. Things are empty. Okay, so there's several things that are challenging for this. Number one, it's copying this entire HTML element, which means that it's essentially doing this. Notice the ID is still staying there. The thing that is changing is simply the class, right? And that's good. So the first thing I need to solve is the attribute of the ID. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and give it an empty ID. That solves the challenge of that duplicating the data as well. And so we come in here again, hit add more. Now it's empty data. That's good. But if I go to save it, it doesn't save anything. And so let's go ahead and check our views. Maybe there's something in the views that should show me that it is saving something. So in here, if request.post or request.method equals to post, let's go ahead and print out request.post. Okay, let's see what that post data is. I'll add another ingredient, pasta noodle, hit save, go back in, take a look at the terminal, and here's our post data. Okay, so now we see where the challenge is. Now this might not be a challenge that you've ever recognized, but here it is right here. We've got form dash underscore underscore prefix dash, all of that stuff. Now let's actually take a look at that same data in a recipe that does have something we could edit, which is just another recipe that I actually have ingredients with. I'll just go ahead and save it and take a look now. So if we look in here now, we see no prefix data in here. Now this is coming from the actual empty form itself, this form right here. And if you're starting to feel like this is overwhelming, just bear with me. You could stop if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, because we're going to solve this in a much easier way with HTMX in a little bit. This should highlight why you should use HTMX, depending on where you are in your development cycle. But the challenge here is all of the things that come in with this. So all of the features and attributes of an empty form do not actually lend itself or tend to lend itself well for just dynamically adding data. It's actually made for that, but it requires a number of items in JavaScript to make it happen. So what that means is that the first thing I need to do is I need to update my actual form, management form that we created. So I need to update this data right here. So let's take a look at that data. I'm going to go back into the other recipe with no ingredients. So if I inspect the element here or view the page, either one, I still see the management form data in here. So it's definitely still showing me this. And notice that the total forms is 0. It's literally always going to be 0 until I change it. But the nice thing is it does have its own ID, and this ID will stay this way unless you modify it in some other capacity. So that means then that I can actually come in here. I can grab what that ID is. So we'll go ahead and say total new forms equals to document.get element by ID yet again. And it's grabbing literally that ID here. Okay. And so what we want from here is we want to update what this value is going to be, right? So before I can update what that value is, I need to actually know how many items are in the form list itself. How many items are in here? This is where we can actually count the number of classes. And this is also why we would want to add our empty form element with the exact same class that's on this one. Okay. So how do we do that? Now, what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and say const current ingredient forms. And this is now going to be document.get elements. This is a plural now by class name. Now, when you have an ID, it's usually specifically about one element. That's best practices, is you only assign one single element to that one single page on that whole thing. Classes, on the other hand, are many elements, can have classes. Now, if you know CSS, you probably already know this. This is just adding on top of that with JavaScript. So what this is going to do is it's going to give me every element that's in there by default and every hidden element that we added in through JavaScript. So in other words, I can actually console log what that length is, right? So let's go ahead and do that inside of our add new form here. So I'll go console log the element itself, so the variable, and then .len length, save that. We refresh in here, add more, go to our console, and now it's showing the length. And it only happens at the beginning, so it's kind of counting behind us a little bit. So it starts with 0, 1, 2, right? Now if we go back to our other one that actually had those values already, it's going to count and add on top of that. So 1, 2, 3 is where it started. Then we added one, which would be 4. Then we added one more, 5. So that's actually how we can get the current length of these items, which means several things. First off, we can now say, I'm going to do let being the current form count is equal to that length. And then I'm going to add 1. Because this is adding 1, it's going to update the current form length to 1 more, essentially, right? So it's going to get that element and it's going to add 1 more. It'd probably be best to have this in the function itself to actually get the document element there, because if I somehow added these more dynamically in another way, this would at least give me what that count is. So I'm going to go ahead and give a constant here. And so now what I need to do is on this form element, I want to add this ID. So I'm going to use some string substitution here. The string substitution inside of JavaScript is very similar to F strings, but just bear with me on this one. So it's $, curly brackets, dash, and that's it. So we're going to add that ID, and it's going to be based off of this current count variable, which should be an integer. So now if we save it, let's go ahead and refresh in here. I'm going to go to my new one. And we'll hit add more. I'll inspect this element here. And on the actual div class itself, it gives me a new ID. Inside of here, I still have these prefixes everywhere, which we'll solve in a second. But it will give me this new ID. And it's correct, form 1, form 2, and so on. So that's good. So now, pretty much the final step we need to do is we need to change all of these prefix values in here to whatever that ID is. Okay. And so I know it's +1 because if we go to one that already exists, maybe it's not +1. Maybe it's actually 0. Maybe it's the actual index value. Right. So this is where just, doing some research on our own can help that a lot. It's going to be the index value. So we actually want whatever the current length is, that's going to be the next form iteration. Okay, cool. So now we're going to use a regular expression. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this. This is the regular expression. It has that prefix in there. And we're going to use this regular expression to just simply replace things that are inside of this empty form element, this copy of this empty form element. So this is really a copy empty form element. And let's actually name it as such so it's a lot easier to reference later. So now inside of here, we use a command for the inner HTML. And we're going to go ahead and just say inner HTML.replace this regular expression here. And we just want to replace it with whatever the current form count is. Kind of. Okay. So it should replace this entire string here, which going and adding a new one will show us what that would look like. Here it is, form 4. And so we should see that prefix changing. We save it and we refresh in here. Let's go back to 2 with none in there. I'm going to add 1, say pasta noodles, unit, and we'll give it a pound. We hit save. We've got some issue. It's not showing up necessarily. Let's go to refresh in here. And let's look in here. Still not working. Okay. So back into our views. We did print out the post data. So let me scroll up a bit. And so what we've got is form 0. We still had the total forms also being at 0. Okay. So the last thing, total new forms. This is where we're going to have to set this value before we append that, for the inner HTML. Set this to set attribute value, and it's now going to be whatever that current count is plus 1. So now it's the actual addition that we need. Okay, so let's try it again. Add one more. Pasta noodles, £1. Hit save. Refresh this page, and sure enough, there it is. Refresh this one, and sure enough, there it is. Cool. All right, so let's go ahead and add a few more, whatever you want in here, and so on and so forth. So it's great. But one of the things that you might be noticing is the form itself is not dynamic. And we can absolutely use JavaScript to make it dynamic. But now we're getting into this whole heap of a brand new programming language that you may or may not want to spend time on. I personally really like JavaScript, and I will spend a lot more time on it in the future. But if you're not ready to dive into that, or you just want a faster way to do this exact same dynamicness, that's something we want to do with HTMX. And we will start doing it in the next one. But the general idea here is adding dynamic elements traditionally is through JavaScript, because it's really the only code that can run in the browser, because the browser itself will run JavaScript. So if we go into View Developer and the JavaScript console again, we did console log things in here, but I can also run actual JavaScript code right in my browser. And you may have seen people do this before where it's like, oh, wow, they just hacked my website. Well, no, but it just seems like they did, right? So document, let's say body, right? So notice that it's actually selecting that. So this is actually another good place to grab some of these elements. Let's go ahead and just paste this in here. And now I can actually test a lot of these things out, right? And so if I did run some of this code and I want to see what's happening here, that would be a way to do it. And notice that it gives me some of those values, and I can investigate even more as to what's going on. So the JavaScript console is really, really useful for those reasons, but it's just a whole nother layer of technology that we would have to learn. Now what we're going to move on to is the tool called HTMX that actually does so much of this legwork for us. And all we have to do is implement some things in our views that are similar to this. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this request post method here and just leave this as is. Of course, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, let's keep going.